Hi, you've clicked on to today's tropical tidbit for Sunday, August 4th. Looking at the Atlantic here, not much to see. We did have ex-Dorian redevelop very briefly into a tropical depression here, and he got absorbed into a front and is moving off to the northeast. Not much to post about, that's why I didn't make a video on it. It was never a threat to make landfall and never a threat to get very strong in here. So he is now gone. The rest of the Atlantic, you can see a void of clouds here in the tropics, so still fairly quiet at the moment, and not much going on. There's actually a cloud of Saharan dust you can see from Africa that's come into the Caribbean from the east, and that is representative of the dry conditions in the area. But we do have a couple of big waves, big dry large amplitude waves coming westward off of Africa here, and these will likely help clear out some of the dry air, and so behind it we might have a more favorable environment for some of these waves to come off as we get deeper into August here and the Cape Verde season really gets into swing. But in the near term, what might be our next threats for possible tropical development? The first one might come from this front that picked up Dorian here. You can see laying itself into the Gulf of Mexico, and this late in the year in August, if these old fronts get trapped, sometimes have to be watched. This is the GFS out to day 5. You can see the old front still here in 5 days into the Gulf of Mexico, and then by day 6 you can see the tail end of the front showing some precipitation here. So something might happen. None of the models actually show tropical development in here, but it might be something to watch nonetheless. Probably nothing significant will come of it considering the models don't support any development, but you could get a sneak tropical storm in here with a situation like this, so always worth watching the tail ends of these fronts. The next possible system could come from one of these waves here. This one near the Caribbean, the Cape Verde Islands over here. This wave fairly dry, again not much thunderstorms with it, but this will be coming westward into the Caribbean during the next 7 to 10 days, and the GFS here shows it in the Western Caribbean. And why do I pick on this particular wave? Tons of them come in the Caribbean all the time. The reason I pick on it is because if we look at the upper level pattern here, at the same time, this is day 10 on the GFS, we have our wave in here in the Western Caribbean. Notice the upper level flow to its north over the northeastern United States is out of the northwest, and I've talked about this before. If you have a tropical disturbance or a wave or whatever coming westward into an area where the flow to its north is out of the northwest, that's a favorable pattern for potential development, because if the flow is to the northwest, to the north of the disturbance, it's moving into an area where upper level outflow can start expanding in this region. So we have a pattern in here that would be favorable for potential expansion of an upper ridge and development underneath. So that will be something to potentially watch. Right now, no models develop anything, but I will keep an eye on it. Now, that's for the next 10 days, but what about the rest of the season here? Are we really going to get the active season? You know, I've been pushing that this will be at least a slightly more active than normal season with the potential for a few hurricane landfalls on the United States. This won't be a 2005 or 2010, but I still think we'll be active. And we're into August now. We still haven't had any hurricanes, though we are still ahead of schedule in terms of a normal season. We have more storms than we're supposed to at this point. So when are we actually going to get active here? Well, I think we will eventually, but this may be one of those seasons that's very cramped near the peak of the season and not too active before the peak and not too active after the peak. But if we look at the sea surface temperature anomaly map here, there's a couple things to point out. Again, the Indian Ocean is frigid in here, the North Indian Ocean. That's important. That gives you sinking air in that region of the world. And also we have fairly cool water over the central equatorial Pacific and eastern equatorial Pacific. And remember, the CFS and the Euro were showing an El Nino developing here in July and lasting through the fall, and that has not happened. There is no orange and red colors here really to speak of. It's mostly blue, and west of South America has really looked more La Nina-like than anything this summer. And when you have this coupled with a cold Indian Ocean, it tends to favor upward motion in this area of the world right here when the tropical Atlantic is warmer than normal. Now notice it's not terribly warmer than normal. There's only a little bit of orange there. It's not red, so it's not like 2010 or 2005. So sometimes these years, although the pattern in general is favorable, sometimes they need a little push. Sometimes they're fairly shut down through mid-August to late August, but after you get later in the year, August and September, the continent starts to cool down in here. And when you start cooling the continent down, pressures rise a little bit more in here and allow the tropics to start going, and it helps force that upward motion in that area. And what can really help this process is when you get cold outbreaks over the United States, like this one shown by the CFS days 11 through 15 mid-August here, and it shows this really for the entire month being cold for most of the lower 48. And so if you get the temperature really cold in here, that means there's not a lot of rising air, there's a lot of sinking, and the pressures increase where it's cold. As you can see here in the orange colors, higher than normal pressures. This can really put a lid on the tropics, if you will, and allow them to start boiling, if we can use that analogy. You can see the pressure starting to lower in here on the model in the tropics. And with high pressure to the north like this is a setup that can allow them to start, and that engine can start turning, and the upward motion in thunderstorms can start yielding tropical cyclones as we get deeper into late August and September during the peak of the season. And this happened in 2004 when we didn't have our first storm until July 31st. Keep in mind, we've already had 4. And then we had a very cold August in 2004. And then their first hurricane, sorry, not their first hurricane, but the first big storm was Charlie coming into Florida August 9th through August 23rd. And then from that point on, in 4 weeks, we had 4 hurricanes hit Florida out of this pattern. So that happened in 2004. It just needed a little push, and then August and September it took off, and then it shut down again in October. And you might be asking, well, what about years like 2010? It was all warm here in August for most of the lower 48, and yet the hurricane season was huge in 2010. Well, the reason is, look at how warm it is in the tropics here in 2010. It was amazing. Lots of heat in the tropics. With this kind of a pattern, the hurricane season is going to go bonkers no matter what you do. Or no matter what's going on up here. But in a year like ours, where the pattern is a little bit more fragile, the Atlantic is not super warm, we need a little bit of a push, and that can happen like it did in 2004 with a cold outbreak here, and that's what we have showing up on the models for this year. So I think the pattern is still going to push this over to a more active season in defiance of the inactive season forecasted still by the European model and some of the other models. So we'll see how that turns out here. And then if we're going to talk about landfalls, if we have a bunch of cold air here, there's obviously a big trough over the United States, and that can have the potential to recurve storms east of the United States. But if we look at the sea surface temperature anomalies, look at how warm the water is off the eastern seaboard and southeastern Canada here. This has been forcing ridging over the northwestern Atlantic all summer long, and if you have a bunch of cold air over the United States, it can't just progress eastward because of this warm pool here, so it tends to back westward into the mountainous regions and start decaying as ridging develops to its northeast here, and that's a pattern that can bring storms in towards the coast. So we're likely to see at least a couple of landfalls out in the western Atlantic region, Caribbean, and United States this year, I feel. It's hard to forecast that for sure, but just so you're aware that the pattern may favor landfalls a little bit more than the previous years. Remember, we're still on a record 8-year streak with no major hurricane landfalls in the U.S. Let's hope that continues, but this year chances favor it ending more than continuing, so we will see how that turns out. Right now, nothing much going on in the tropics. Still waiting for the big ramp up later this month, I think, latter part of August, and then September, the peak of the season, could have a lot of storms to come with it, similar to 2004, which so far has been a great analog for this summer for the Atlantic and the U.S. So we'll keep an eye on this front later towards this weekend to see if anything comes of that, and then some waves coming across the Atlantic may need to be watched, specifically one in about 10 days in here, so we will keep an eye on that. All right, that's it for today. Thanks for watching.